Guys, we've got more major stuff regarding realignment, including huge information I have just unearthed through an individual who DM'd me on Twitter. This all, of course, regarding conference realignment, regarding ESPN's relationship with the ACC, of course, the ACC network. Just how much money does ESPN have invested in the ACC network? Is there a high incentive for ESPN to push for the ACC to stay together? Because we've been talking about this domino effect, which would potentially start with the Big Ten taking teams from the Pac-12, which would then trigger the SEC trying to poach teams from the ACC. But we've got huge intel via a podcast to get to. Take a look at this. The latest pod is live. The big get, Burke Magnus, who apparently is the number 2 ESPN exec and the main man involved in all of ESPN's college football moves. And guys, this podcast has been fully summarized by somebody who DM'd me. So let's read this, let's digest it, and understand how much of an influence ESPN has over the ACC remaining together. Let's take a look at this. Great interview with Burke Magnus, ESPN President of Programming and Content. So this is some big shot within ESPN here. Big college football realignment info. Truth about how the ACC deal is important. It remains long-term through 2036. Big 12 stable. Wants partnership with Big 12. So I'm assuming ESPN wants to do a partnership with the Big 12. That's what this is saying. And then a hard no when asked about college football going to the 2 potential super conferences, being the Big Ten around 24 teams and the SEC being around 24 teams. ESPN's number 1 exec says it's not happening. And then we've got the big enchilada regarding the ACC. Magnus said it's all about the ACC network. ESPN put a huge chunk of money down up front to launch the ACC network. Says it can take up to 20 years to see return. Basically, ESPN wants the ACC intact as is, full term. And then he later says that the long-term network will be consumed by the SEC network. He later says with all that ESPN invested in the ACC network up front, it would have to remain intact to get any return. ESPN would lose money if teams left, so the SEC wouldn't make more anyhow. I think he's saying the SEC would get diluted if they took on 4 teams, possibly to get to 20 teams. But guys, this is huge info regarding a top ESPN exec who went on a podcast apparently and said, listen, this is a situation where we've invested so much money into the ACC network. We're not willing to pivot and just let the ACC be consumed by the SEC and by possibly the Big 12, which is kind of something we've rumored, we've speculated. Also, maybe the Big 10 taking, maybe a team like North Carolina, Virginia, things like that. We've got ESPN's top exec saying, look, we've put so much money into it, it makes no sense for us to see this conference dissolve. And on top of it, if the SEC gets to 20 teams, they're not even going to be making more money because the teams joining the SEC won't be big enough gets. It'll end up actually diluting the conference. If you go from 16 teams to 20 teams, you've got to pay 4 more teams a certain amount of money. So this is major, major stuff. The news right now, apparently, from ESPN and from their executives. And remember, guys, these companies like ESPN, Fox, all of these major TV networks have such an influence over all of this realignment that if ESPN wants to see the ACC stay afloat, it's going to stay afloat. Now, I still maintain the theory that I think something needs to be done in regards to this grant of rights deal that runs through 2036. I'm guessing it'll get renegotiated, and teams like Clemson and Florida State, and maybe even everyone, will make a little bit more. But in terms of this scenario, we keep hearing about the Big Ten getting to 20 teams. The Pac-12 getting possibly to 16 or 20 teams, depending on how many teams they get. And the SEC then getting to 20 teams. It poses an interesting question now if this is legitimate. We know that the Big Ten is going forward. They want 20 teams. Kevin Warren has come out and said, listen, we want a West Wing. We want 20 teams. They want to balance their conference. It makes complete sense. But now we're in this unique situation where if ESPN wants the ACC to stay together because they've got so much money invested into the ACC network, are we talking about more unbalanced conferences? Because where would the SEC get to 20 teams? Why would it make any financial sense for the SEC if they're not able? If the ACC is off limits, I don't know where the SEC would go to get more teams. I think they would just stay at 16 because you're not sniping teams off of the Big 12 and making more money. You'll just dilute your conference even more. So this is major stuff. This is a podcast that's been summarized, and this is just a dude who listened to the podcast and said, look, we've got ESPN's number 2 high-ranking exec coming out and saying, we've put so much money into the ACC network, we're not dissolving the conference. The conference is staying alive. Now, whether or not a new deal gets worked out, that makes Clemson, that makes North Carolina, that makes FSU a little bit more happy, we will see if that ends up happening. But right now, it looks like the ACC, due to ESPN influence with the ACC network, is staying together. That is major, major stuff there. And then, guys, this is a major story that came out last week that nobody talked about, but this is the groundwork of college football evolution. It says college football's playoff board discusses potential of restructuring how college football is governed. And this has to do with paying players, NIL, breaking away from the NCAA, because we know how horrible of a job the NCAA's done governing college football, governing the NIL stuff. It says the 11 college presidents and chancellors who make up the College Football Playoffs Board of Managers met via Zoom on Monday. This was last Monday, by the way, and began a discussion that could reshape the future of college sports. Multiple sources told ESPN that the Board of Managers briefly discussed the possibility of restructuring how college football is governed, with the idea presented of major college football potentially being governed outside of the NCAA. And guys, this is what's going to happen. I'm just telling you right now. The evolution of college football. If we have conferences signing multi-billion-dollar TV deals, college football is at the point where it's basically become bigger than the NCAA. And we've already seen multiple scenarios where the NCAA just gets completely walked over by many of these teams' boosters. There's no enforcement from the NCAA. It's been a joke for a while now. Sources cautioned that these discussions are in such early stages that it could be considered the first steps of a complicated process that would resemble a marathon. The sources added that the group spoke about the idea for only about 5 minutes, as it was raised as something the group should think more about down the line. So these are the early steps of the evolution of college football. This is something down the line. Nobody's talking about it right now, but when teams are making this much money in their TV deals, when the NCAA has literally no governing power over anyone when it comes to NIL, when it comes to boosters, this is a situation you're going to have to look at and say, we've become so much more powerful. The NCAA, there's no reason. It's a separate entity at this point. It's a separate thing. The conversation, it's not even college athletics, especially if the kids are getting paid. It's like its own professional minor league type thing. The conversation is significant, however, in that it's the first known discussion among a group that would seemingly have the power to put such a plan in action, and the college football playoff looms as the most likely destination for running major college football outside of the NCAA. Of course, I think maybe I got this wrong, but I believe there is a meeting that the College Football Playoff Committee or whatever, the people that decide, they're supposed to have a meeting in the coming days about possibly expanding the playoff, which they will do. That's a guarantee, and I think they'll do it by 2024. There was also, I couldn't find the article, but there was an article about why it just makes so much sense from a dollar standpoint to expand the playoff to at least 12 or 16 teams. I think it's going to be 12 teams. To me, that's the happy medium with the first 4 teams getting byes. But guys, I just wanted to bring this to your attention. This is the first official evidence we've gotten to where these chancellors, these presidents are talking about possibly branching off of the NCAA. And this is really the first step of the evolution of college football. And this is something that's probably going to be talked about a lot more next offseason. But guys, the major stuff when it comes to the realignment, a podcast between an individual and an ESPN executive where the executive apparently comes out and says, listen, we've got too much money tied up into the ACC network. We're not willing to see the ACC dissolve, because I had theorized that maybe ESPN would just get in bed with the Big 12 and take all their TV rights if the Big 12 took 4 teams from the Pac-12 and 4 teams from the ACC, but they don't want anything happening to the ACC. So now we're at a very interesting point where we know the Big Ten wants to get to 20 teams. We thought the SEC would be the ones to react to that and then get to 20 teams, possibly taking ACC teams. But now if ESPN is saying the ACC is off limits, I'm guessing the SEC would just remain at 16 teams because it all comes down to money. And the SEC taking teams from the Big 12 would not make them more money. It would actually lose them money because it would dilute the overall teams. There's no teams the Big 12 has that would really be sufficient in terms of making more revenue. You could argue that Florida State, North Carolina, Miami, teams like Clemson, teams like that would actually help the SEC, and it would be an even more attractive conference for ESPN to put more money into financially. They would have more windows, more everything. Actually, I don't think they would have more. That's one of the big issues that the SEC has right now compared to the Big Ten. The Big Ten has basically all of the TV windows except for the Mountain Time Zone. That's the whole idea of the Big Ten maybe going after Colorado, which I don't see. I don't think they would go after Colorado just for the TV market. I mean, you're getting the Denver market. I understand that. And then the time zone, that's the other thing. But either way, I think the Big Ten is still getting to 20 teams. Certainly, we've got Kevin Warren coming out publicly saying it's happening. But if this is true, that was the big elephant in the room when it came. How much did ESPN have invested into the ACC network? And could they possibly turn the ACC network into the Big 12 network? Apparently, this executive is saying that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is the ACC is going to be alive. We're keeping it alive. We do not want 2 super conferences. That's what he's saying in this podcast, and this is major, major stuff. So, guys, make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description. I'm, of course, the Depressed Ginger. Thank you for watching.